So we're going to start, and I have the shield here. And again, like I said, we wanted regular stitch length 2.5. Drop the needle just beside that fly shield, back stitch, and head on up. So this one is a nice even 5/8. I had made a mark so I could see where to pivot and continue around the top of my waistband. So I'm stitching at 5/8 inch seam allowance, center back. Sewing around the curve. Moving pins as I go. Okay, and there I am back to the front. And I'm gonna have to pivot a little bit. And head down to the side of the shield. Or the facing, sorry. Okay, want my seam allowance. Oh, I forgot to mention something. But I think I did in the previous video. I can tell I'm gonna have to fix that. So I'm not gonna back stitch. I got a little too close, so I need to move that. All right, so in case that happens to you, you can see I've gotta straighten this up a bit. It'll be better if I trim this and then measure and go straight up. So I'm gonna go ahead and fix that. But what I started to mention too is I mentioned it in the last video, but I forgot to start out. Our seam allowance is pushed up, pressed up into the waistband. So you want to sew it that way too. So you want that seam allowance up into the waistband. So I've sewn the waistband facing on, and since it is a facing, we have to do all those things that we do on a facing. We have to clip the corner to reduce the bulk. So do that on both front corners. And we need to trim down the seam, and we need to understitch. Now we don't necessarily need to grade the seam because it's an area where unless you had a super bulky fabric, you might want to grade the seam. But just trimming the seam allowance down now to about 1/4 of an inch, fat quarter, skinny 3/8. So you can see I'm just going around the top. Oops, got a little skinny there, and trimming that seam down just to reduce the bulk. Okay, now I'll be turning this. I'll trim the front a little bit too. The other side doesn't need trimmed because it was a little shorter. All right, so what you want to do to turn this, you want to push the seam allowance away from you and turn that corner. That pushes the seam allowance up into the corner and actually fills in the corner so you get a sharp corner nicely. Then use your point turner to push that corner nice and square. Do the same on the other. So this time I'll go with my left hand, pushing the seam allowance away from me and into that corner. Still need to use the point turner to get a nice sharp corner. All right, now we can just kind of lightly press that seam allowance towards the facing, because now we have to do our understitch. So just like we did on the neck facing, just like we did on the fly facing, just like we did on the pocket facings, we understitch by pushing our seam allowance towards the facing and stitching 1/8 inch from that seam. So I've just given it a little light press to make it a little bit easier. Push towards the right. So now I can't get all the way in the corner. So go as close as you can, regular stitch length. So get as close as you can to the corner. Make sure the seam allowance is pushed towards the facing, and do your 1/8 inch understitch. Making sure to keep this flat and that the seam allowance is pushed towards the facing. Oops. And I'm all the way back to the front. I took my eye off the road for a minute there. Okay, all understitched. That's where I took my eye off the road. I got a little swerved. Hopefully I didn't hit anybody. Okay, now we're gonna do some pressing. I have already started to pin part of this because it takes a while. It takes some noodling. So anyways, I'll pin the other side with you. Also, you want to pin, you want to make sure that the seam turns slightly to the inside facing, just slightly. That's what the understitch is supposed to help with. Give that waistband a good press. Okay, and ideally, what we pressed under is covering up that seam, the waist seam. Up a little bit. Little fanoodling. Steaming it in a little bit. Okay, and pinning.